What the Buddha Taught by Walpola Rahula. And let's read and comment on chapter 8, What the Buddha Taught and the World Today. Now, if anybody even knows the names of the 18 types of original Buddhism, Orthodox Buddhism as you would call it, other than Theravada, please comment below. Because I don't even remember what source they're in. It'd be interesting to look into something other than Theravada as an older form of Buddhism. There are some who believe that Buddhism is so lofty and sublime a system that it cannot be practiced by ordinary men and women in this workaday world of ours, and that one has to retire from it to a monastery or to some quiet place if one desires to be a true Buddhist. And that reminds me of something in Surah 24 of Al-Quran that talks about the, is it 24 that talks about the person who goes about in the marketplace and that doesn't distract them from the remembrance. And that's how Buddhism is don't let the, what's going on cause you to think that this is your, what it's doing to you is yourself. This is a sad misconception, due evidently to a lack of understanding of the teaching of the Buddha. People run to such hasty and wrong conclusions as a result of their hearing or reading casually something about Buddhism written by someone who, as he has not understood the subject in all aspects, gives only a partial and lopsided view of it. The Buddha's teaching is meant not only for monks and monasteries, but also for ordinary men and women living at home with their families. The Noble Eightfold Path, which is the Buddhist way of life, is meant for all, without distinction of any kind. The vast majority of people in the world cannot turn monk or retire into caves or forests. However noble and pure Buddhism may be, it would be useless to the masses of mankind if they could not follow it in their daily life in the world of today. But if you understand the spirit of Buddhism correctly, and not only its letter, you can surely follow and practice it while living the life of an ordinary man. Now, if you have proper translations, and you have, and you understand what is meant by the wordings of those translations, you don't even have to have the original of anything spiritual or psychological or philosophical. I mean, it would be nice, but don't let any conservatives tell you that you can't look directly at these things and have your own opinions. Because if they're saying you don't speak the language, it's a very simple point to make that the people who speak the language are making these points about what it says. So are we, there may be some who find it easier and more convenient to accept Buddhism if they do live in a remote place, cut off from the society of others. Now, Epicureanism is definitely one of those things that is easier to be an Epicurean or a hedonist, which is basically the same thing, some differences. If you're, off living in pegs and heaths, as one might call it. Others may find that kind of retirement dulls and depresses their whole being, both physically and mentally, and that it may not, therefore, be conducive to the development of their spiritual and intellectual life. True renunciation does not mean running away physically from the world. Sariputta, the chief disciple of the Buddha, said that one man may live in a forest, devoting himself to ascetic practices, but that might be full of impure thoughts and defilements. Another might live in a village or town, practicing no ascetic discipline, but his mind may be pure and free from defilements. Of these two, said Sariputta, the one who lives a pure life in the village or town is definitely far superior to and greater than the one who lives in the forest. And one of the things we see, if the material culture, or lack of it, is necessary for the path rather than something you have to adapt one way or the other, then there's a severe deficiency in the path. The common belief that to follow the Buddhist teaching, one has to retire from life is a misconception. It is really an unconscious defense against practicing it. There are numerous references in Buddhist literature to men and women living ordinary, normal family lives who successfully practiced what the Buddha taught and realized nirvana. Vacchagotta, the wanderer, whom we met earlier in the chapter on anatta, once asked the Buddha straightforwardly whether there were laymen and women leading the family life who followed his teaching successfully and attained to high spiritual states. The Buddha categorically stated that there was not one or two, not 100 or 200 or 500, but many more laymen and women leading the family life who followed his teaching successfully and attained to high spiritual states. It may be agreeable for some certain people to have lived a retired life in a quiet place, away from noise and disturbance. Oh, don't let the country fool you. Have you ever gone camping and it turns out to be, the logging trucks wake you up? If not, people thinking, well, we're out here, we can make a whole lot of noise. Experience with camping will teach you that most places that are remote aren't necessarily quiet. There's exceptions, but you may try a lot of trial and error. Oh, you go to camping once or twice in your life and you go every year, but only a couple of those places were ever usable like that. But it is sometimes you got to wait for hours to find your moment and keep your practice up, and then in those 10 minutes of quiet, like what I did on Sassafras Mountains, is like that took 2 hours of being up there to shoot that less than 10 minutes of video and get in the mood, But it is certainly more praiseworthy and courageous to practice Buddhism, living among your fellow beings, helping them and being of service to them. It may perhaps be useful in some cases for a man to live in a retirement for a time in order to improve his mind and character as preliminary moral, spiritual, and intellectual training, to be strong enough to come out later and help others. But if a man lives all his life in solitude, thinking only of his own happiness and salvation, without caring for his fellows, this surely is not in keeping with the Buddha's teaching, which is based on love, compassion, and service to others. One might now ask if a man can follow Buddhism while living the life of an ordinary layman. Why was the Sangha, the order of monks established by the Buddha? The order provides opportunity for those who are willing to devote their lives not only to their own spiritual and intellectual development, but also to the service of others. An ordinary layman with a family cannot be expected to devote his whole life to the service of others, whereas a monk with no family responsibilities or other worldly ties is in a position to devote his whole life for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, according to the Buddha's advice. That is how, in the course of history, the Buddhist monastery became not only a spiritual center, but also a center of learning and culture. The Sigala Sutta, number 31 of the Digha Nikaya, shows with great respect the layman's life, his family and social relations are regarded by the Buddha. A young man named Sigala used to worship the 6 cardinal points of heaven: east, south, west, north, nadir, and zenith. In obeying and observing the last advice given him by his dying father, the Buddha told the young man that in the noble discipline, Ariyasa Vinaya, of his teaching, the 6 directions were different. According to his noble discipline, the 6 directions were east, parents; south, teachers; west, wife and children; north, friends, relatives, and neighbors; nadir, servants, workers, and employers; zenith, religious men. Now, acknowledgement is different than worship. We have the word that's often translated as worship when we may just be calling something to mind. In all Sanskrit-related languages and a lot of the Persian-based languages, there's sort of that dual meaning of bringing something to mind. one should remember these 6 directions, said the Buddha. Here the word worship. Oh, okay. Namaskaya is very significant, for one worships something sacred, something worthy of honor and respect. These 6 family and social groups mentioned above are treated in Buddhism as sacred, worthy of respect and worship. But how is one to worship them? The Buddha says that one could worship them by only performing one's duties towards them. These duties are explained in his discourse to Sagala. So, in reference to what you bring to mind is part of the meaning of that word. So it doesn't necessarily mean worship as in you're taking something as a god. It's like in yoga, religion, whatever you want to call it, you have something called the duties to humanity and the duties to, First, the parents are sacred to their children. The Buddha says parents are called Brahma. Brahmate Mata Pitaro. The term Brahma denotes the highest and most sacred conception in Indian thought, and in it the Buddha includes parents. So good Buddhist families, at the present time, children literally worship their parents every day, morning and evening. They have to perform certain duties towards their parents according to the noble discipline. They should look after their parents in their old age and should do whatever they have to do on their behalf, should maintain the honor of the family and continue the family tradition, should protect the wealth earned by the parents and perform their funeral rites after death. Parents, in their turn, have certain responsibilities towards their children. They should keep their children away from evil courses, should engage them in good and preferable activities, should give them a good education, and should marry them into good families, and should hand over the property to them in due course. Second, the relation between teacher and pupil. A pupil should respect and be obedient to his teacher, should attend to his needs, if any, should study earnestly, and the teacher, in his turn, should train and shape his pupil properly, should teach him well, should introduce him to his friends, and should try to procure him security or employment when his education is over. Third, the relation between husband and wife. Love between husband and wife is considered the most religious or sacred. It is called Sadara Brahmacharya, sacred family life. Here too, the significance of the term Brahma should be noted. The highest respect is given to this relationship. Wives and husbands should be faithful, respectful, and devoted to each other, and they have certain duties towards each other. The husband should always honor his wife and never be wanting in respect to her. He should love her and be faithful to her, should secure her position and comfort, should please her by presenting her with clothing and jewelry. The fact that the Buddha did not forget to mention even such a thing as gifts a husband should make to his wife shows how understanding and sympathetic were his humane feelings towards ordinary human beings. Oh, ordinary human emotions. Okay. The wife, in her turn, should supervise and look after household affairs, should entertain guests, visitors, friends, relatives, and employees, should love and be faithful to her husband, should protect his earnings, and should be clever and energetic in all activities. And, it's not that we're, if you try to fight the fact, I have emotions, I have feelings, I have sensations, and it's like, I have thoughts, you can't, that's not exactly the path. So definitely these things should be taken care of, right? Fourth, the relation between friends, relatives, and neighbors. They should be hospitable and charitable to one another, should speak pleasantly and agreeably, should work for each other's welfare, should be on equal terms with one another, should not quarrel among themselves, should help each other in need, and should not forsake each other in difficulty. Fifth, the relation between master and servant. The master, our employer, has several obligations towards his servant or his employee. Work should be assigned according to ability and capacity. Adequate wages should be paid. Medical needs should be provided. Occasional donations or bonuses should be granted. The servant or employee, in his turn, should be diligent and not lazy, honest and obedient, and not cheat his master. He should be earnest in his work. Sixth, the relation between the religious, recluses and brahmanas, and the laity. Lay people should look after the material needs of the religious with love and respect. The religious with a loving heart should impart knowledge and learning to the laity and lead them along the good path away from evil. Now, the needs of if holding a class and things that require physical material, if that's part of the role in religious in spiritual things, that's one thing. You may want to help somebody in their studies or something, but the idea that somebody who's not in need in terms of their needs of life, shouldn't that come through regular work? We see then that the lay life with its family and social relations is included in the noble discipline as within the framework of the Buddhist way of life, as the Buddha envisaged it. So, in the Samyutta Nikaya, one of the oldest Pali texts, Sakka was the king of the gods, the devas. That's a mistranslation. We're talking about angels here. The Devi declares that he worships not only the monks who live in a virtuous holy life, but also the lay disciples, Upasaka, who perform meritorious deeds, who are virtuous and maintain their families righteously. See, again, none of this has to do with what a lot of people would say is worship. Now, some people do worship angels and saints and stuff like that. I'm not refuting that. I think likely most Buddhists do that sort of thing. If one desires to become a Buddhist, there is no initiation ceremony or baptism which one has to undergo, but to become a bhikkhu, a member of the order of the Sangha, one has to undergo a long process of disciplinary training and education. If one understands the Buddhist teaching, and if one is convinced that his teaching is the right path, and if one tries to follow it, then one is a Buddhist. But according to the unbroken age-old tradition in Buddhist countries, one is considered a Buddhist if one takes the Buddha, the Dhamma, the teaching, and the Sangha, the order of monks generally called the Triple Gem, as one's refuges, and undertakes to observe the 5 precepts, Pancha Sila, the minimum moral obligation of a lay Buddhist: not to destroy life, not to steal, not to commit adultery, or any sex outside of marriage, by the way, not to tell lies, not to take intoxicating drinks, and reciting the formulas given in the ancient text. On religious occasions, Buddhists in congregation usually recite these formulas following the lead of a Buddhist monk. And so the stealing and the lying would be in your typical yoga, 4 commandments of yoga. But here we have it broken into 5, because you have the unlawful shedding of blood, the conscious, the gambling and other dishonest behavior, the no intoxication, no sex outside of marriage, not necessarily in those orders, right? There is no external rites or ceremonies which a Buddhist has to perform. Buddhism is a way of life, and what is essential is following the Noble Eightfold Path. Of course, there are in all Buddhist countries simple and beautiful ceremonies on religious occasions. There are shrines with statues of Buddha, stupas, or dagabas, and bo trees, and monasteries where Buddhists worship, offer flowers, light lamps, and burn incense. This should not be likened to prayer in theistic religions. It is only a way of paying homage to the memory of the Master who showed the way. These traditional observances, although inessential, have their value in satisfying the religious emotions and needs of those who are less advanced intellectually and spiritually, and helping them gradually along the path. And, well, it would be worship. See, Sarnath, India. So if you feel you have to make statues and offerings and stuff to show them honor, now including things where you list off, oh, here's the ones we look up to, but it would be theism to be like addressing them in worship or in these offerings. Like this is like grave goods. Grave goods don't have to be as such, but some people do worship the dead through grave goods. Those who think that Buddhism is interested only in lofty ideals, high moral and philosophical thought, and that it ignores the social and economic welfare of people are wrong. The Buddha was interested in the happiness of men. To him, happiness was not possible without leading a pure life based on moral and spiritual principles, but he knew that leading such a life was hard in unfavorable material and social conditions. Buddhism does not consider material welfare as an end in itself. It is only a means to an end, a higher and nobler end, but it is a means which is indispensable in achieving a higher purpose for men's happiness. So Buddhism recognizes the needs for certain minimal material conditions favorable to spiritual success, even that of a monk engaged in meditation in some solitary place. And Buddhist monks, members of the order of the Sangha, are not expected to have personal property, but they are allowed to hold communal Sangika property. And so rather than the philosophy you hear from some people that, oh, everything that happens is deserved, so therefore let's not help the poor, that is definitely not the point to be being made, right? The Buddha did not take life out of the context of its social and economic background. He looked at it as a whole. In all its social, economic, and political aspects, his teachings on ethical, spiritual, and philosophical problems are fairly well known, but little is known, particularly in the West, about his teachings on social, economic, and political matters. Yet there are numerous discourses dealing with these scattered throughout the ancient Buddhist texts. Let us only take a few examples. The Chakkavattya Sihanada Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, number 26, clearly states that poverty, dalidya, is the cause of immortality and crimes, such as theft, falsehood, violence, hatred, cruelty, etc. Kings in ancient times, like governments today, tried to suppress crime through punishment. The Kutta Danta Sutta of the same Nikaya explains how futile this is. It says that this method can never be successful. Instead, the Buddha suggests that, in order to eradicate crime, the economic condition of the people should be improved. Grain and other faculties for agriculture should be provided for farmers and cultivators. Capital should be provided for traders and those engaged in business. Adequate wages should be paid to those who are employed. When the people are thus provided for with opportunities for earning a sufficient income, they will be contented and will have no fear or anxiety, and consequently, the country will be peaceful and free of crime. Well, not quite, but if people realize their needs are met, they're less likely to, there's not the difficulty which can cause to suffer. But if they have incessant clinging for more, like in capitalist society, that may continue. Because of this, the Buddha told people how important it is to improve their economic condition. This does not mean that he approved of hoarding wealth with desire and attachment, which is against his fundamental teaching, nor did he approve of each and every way of earning one's livelihood. There are certain trades, like the production and sale of armaments, which he condemns as an evil means of livelihood, as we saw earlier. A man named Digha Janu once visited the Buddha and said, "Venerable Sir, we are ordinary laymen, leading the family life with wife and children. Would the Blessed One teach us some doctrines which be conducive to our happiness in this world and hereafter?" The Buddha tells him that there are 4 things which are conducive to a man's happiness in this world. First, he should be skilled, efficient, earnest, and energetic in whatever profession he is engaged, and should know it well. Uttana Sampada. Second, he should protect his income which he has thus earned righteously, with the sweat of his brow. Araka Sampada. This refers to protecting wealth from thieves, etc. All these ideas should be considered against the background of the period. Third, he should have good friends. Kalyana Vitta, who are faithful, learned, virtuous, liberal, and intelligent, who will help him along the right path away from evil. Fourth, he should spend reasonably, in proportion to his income, neither too much nor too little, i.e., he should not hoard wealth avariciously, nor should he be extravagant. In other words, he should live within his means. Sama Jivikata. Then the Buddha expounds the 4 virtues conducive to a layman's happiness hereafter. Saddha, he should have faith and confidence in moral, spiritual, and intellectual values. Sila, he should abstain from destroying and harming life, from stealing and cheating, from adultery, from falsehood, and from intoxicating drinks. Chagga, he should practice charity, generosity without attachment and craving for his wealth. Panna, he should develop wisdom, which leads to the complete destruction of suffering, to the realization of nirvana. Sometimes the Buddha even went into details about saving money and spending it, as for instance when he told the young man, Sigala, that he should spend 1/4 of his income on his daily expenses, invest half in his business, and put aside 1/4 for any emergency. Once the Buddha told Anathapindika of the great banker, one of his most devoted lay disciples, who founded for him the celebrated Jetavana monastery at Savatthi, that a layman who leads an ordinary family life has 4 kinds of happiness. The first happiness is to enjoy economic security, or sufficient wealth, acquired by just and righteous means. Atte sukha. Figure out what your actual means are. You'll be a lot happier if you figure out what your needs are, rather than just your wants. The second is spending that wealth liberally on himself and family, his friends and relatives, and on meritorious deeds. Bhoga sukha. The third is to be free from debts. Anana sukha. The fourth happiness is to live a faultless and a pure life without committing evil in thought, word, or deed. Anavajja sukha. Notice in Kanon Zardusht that they have the good thought, the good word, and the good deed. And in the dogma of Engermenu, they have the evil thought, the evil word, and the evil deed. It must be noted here that 3 of these kinds are economic, and the Buddha finally reminded the banker that economic and material happiness is not worth 1/16th part of the spiritual happiness arising out of a faultless and good life. And the charging of usury, taking advantage of the people that have needs to put them into debt beyond what they're being put into debt, that's not necessarily what one should be doing as a spiritual individual, but don't abandon all spirituality because you take part in such a sin as the interest. Now you can say adjusted, $2019, I want $2019 back, that sort of thing. But from the few examples given above, one could see that the Buddha considered economic welfare as requisite for human happiness, but he did not recognize progress as real and true if it was only material, devoid of a spiritual and moral foundation. While encouraging mental progress, Buddhism always lays great stress on the development of the moral and spiritual character for a happy, peaceful, and contented society. The Buddha was just as clear on politics, on war and peace. It is too well known to be repeated here that Buddhism advocates and preaches nonviolence and peace as its universal message, and does not approve of any kind of violence or destruction of life. According to Buddhism, there is nothing that can be called a just war, which is only a false term coined and put into circulation to justify and excuse hatred, cruelty, violence, and massacre. Who decides what is just or unjust? The mighty and the victorious are just, and the weak and the defeated are the unjust. Our war is always just, and your war is always unjust. Buddhism does not accept this position. Now, in the Islamic world, one of the things they have is the curse of God upon those who fight for conversions. So people have different philosophies. They have their own system of judgment. We're not going to fight them ever for that. They also have the idea that if you're fighting, there's borders. It's one thing if land was recently taken or something like that, but to reclaim, just to increase the amount of land a country has, that is not a just war. If you want other resources, if you want slaves, this is not a just war. And on top of that, there are so many conditions that basically almost every war in history, by the concept of just war, must be condemned. The Buddha not only taught nonviolence and peace, but he even went into the field of battle itself and intervened personally and prevented war, as in the case of the dispute between the Sakyas and the Kuliyas, who were prepared to fight over the question of the waters of the Rohini, and his words once prevented King Ajatasattu from attacking the kingdom of the Vajas. In the days of the Buddha, as today, there were rulers who governed their countries unjustly. People were oppressed and exploited, tortured and persecuted. Excessive taxes were imposed, and cruel punishments were inflicted. Now, there may be issues with the taxed enough already, people, but let's be real. The government could do more with less taxes. We don't need more taxes to improve anything in society. The Buddha was deeply moved by these inhumanities. The Dhammapada records that he, therefore, directed his attention to the problem of good government. His views should be appreciated against the social, economic, and political background of his time. He had shown how a whole country could become corrupt, degenerate, and unhappy with heads of government. That is, the king, the ministers, and administrative officers become corrupt and unjust. For a country to be happy, it must have a just government. How this form of just government could be realized is explained by the Buddha in his teaching of the 10 duties of the king, Dasa, Raja, Dhamma, as given in the Jata text. Of course, the term king, Raja, of old should be replaced today by the term government. The 10 duties of the king, therefore, should apply to all those who constitute the government, such as the head of the state, ministers, political leaders, legislative and administrative officers, etc. And speaking of, one thing we have is in... Oh, let me just leave this for the next time. In Pakistan, there are 2 things on their constitution. Now, if they follow these 2 things, they'd be an Islamic state, but they don't follow those things. And one is about no law conflicting with the revelation and the inspiration. The second one is that we humans, we have delegative, not legislative things. The principles of safety and such, that's a different matter than some things that we might look at.